Okay, it's the final lecture. Thank you for staying with me for the whole series. This is lecture number 16 in 7 weeks. We've been to the bottom of human nature. We've been right to the bottom of hell. We've been freezing on the floor of ice with two skulls eating each other in a cannibalistic act of horror at the bottom of Dante's Inferno. We've been up Mount Purgatorio as well, all the way up all 7 terraces. There's no paradise in this course, it's just sin. I thought it would be fun for the very final lecture to undermine, in a slightly irritating way, all 3 words. I'm not going to undermine the 7-ness of the 7 deadly sins, really. We've been through this. We know that it starts as 8 generic thoughts. Why 7? There's no answer. The Zoroastrians have 31 deadly sins. Christianity only 7. It does seem a bit limited. I'm not going to spend much time on that. However, I do want to focus on 2 aspects. The sinfulness of sin. What makes a sin a sin? And so in this lecture, I'm going to ask, that's my first question, which is, what is evil? I know it's a question that we should have started with. We probably did start with this. This is kind of creepy, isn't it? Because I'm talking to them as people who were here in the first week. I'm now talking to you in this room as people who weren't here. We didn't start with the question, what is evil, necessarily. We've implicitly been touching on it throughout the course. So it's a chance to revisit that question, what is evil? What actually makes evil? Evil, is there such a thing as evil? It's a problematic concept. We're going to touch on that question, or go back to that question and touch on all 7 sins as we do so. And then finally, the final part of the lecture series, how to fight sin. We'll reflect again on all of the different ways of combating sin that we've encountered. And I'm going to pick out 5 different methods for combating sin. No doubt you'll all think of more, or maybe you'll think of Oscar Wilde, the best way to deal with temptation is to give in to it. That is one of the options, but there are 4 others. So let's start with what is evil then. What is evil? We did begin with this, I think, just a little bit, but now let's go through 4 different hypotheses. 4 different hypotheses of what makes evil, and we can think about all 7 sins. Is evil a principle? Is there a principle of evil? A principle, a thing, a positivity to evil, something that you can follow. I follow the principle of evil, I choose not to follow good. Does that make sense as a concept, as a conceptual understanding of evil? Is evil an absence? Is it simply a big vacuum, a big lot of nothing, a total vacuum where good could be? Obviously, that's one theory. I'm sure some of you already know who that theory we can identify to. And then, can evil be a choice? Look, we've throughout the course, we've touched upon the problem. When does a sin become a mortal sin or a deadly sin? When does a vice become something that could, be deadly? When does it become a problem? We all get angry. We all have, something that we could call gluttony at some point in our lives. When does it become a problem? We've seen all of these writers fall apart over this question. Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, Bernard of Clairvaux, they all fall apart. Dante. Can evil be a choice? It's still not, for me, resolved. There's a big paradox at the heart of that question, can evil be a choice? And we'll get to it. And finally, is human nature evil? It would be a good exam question for Thursday. It probably would be a fantastic exam question. Is fighting the 7 deadly sins really just fighting human nature? Is this, and I think back to, and I think a few of you were here when we talked about Dante's Ulysses, and there's this great paradox, a wonderful paradox in the Inferno when we encounter Ulysses, the great hero in Canto, I think it's 26, really deep down in hell. Ulysses, the great Greek hero. Why is he in hell? He's in hell because he told all of his crew to sail on. Sail on. We haven't got to the end of the world yet. Sail on. Don't be satisfied with what you've seen. Think of the adventure. Think of the glory to come. For Primo Levi, and we discussed this, guys, in seminar talking about lust. For Primo Levi, this is a great moment of heroism. There, in the bottom of hell, we see a hero like Ulysses, who's being punished for his bravery, being punished for following human nature, the human desire for discovery, for bravery, for exploration. Is God a cruel God who wants us not to be human after all and will punish by putting us in a licking flame for just trying to be human? Is that what the sins are really about, punishing humanity? Someone like Nietzsche might say so. And of course, there's another view too. Let's not get too carried away now. Let's go through them one by one. Is evil a principle? Is evil a principle? Is it a problem or not? I mean, do you think evil is something positive that you can follow, a principle that exists? We could go back to Plato's theory of forms. Is there an evil? Is there a perfect ideal evil for Plato? Does anyone know the answer to that, by the way? Oh, sorry, I forgot about the microphone. We want to immortalize your words. It might not sound like it's working, but it is working.
I'm not an expert of Plato, but I don't remember using Plato, that concept of idea of evil, but you could easily, since he uses the idea of beauty, well, or goodness, maybe simply by opposition to one of these ideas, probably that of good, you have evil.
Maybe Julie was going to add something.
Yeah, that's the paradox in Plato, because if it's evil is rather deviation from the idea, so embodiment is evil. And the same you were talking about, if evil is passivity, not conscious, goal-directed activity, then it's a problem. It can't be evil.
Yes. As I understand it, for Plato, there is no ideal evil. There is no principle of evil in Plato. As I understand it then, the idea of evil as absence can originate in Plato, the idea that actually it's a deviation, as you say, Louis, deviation from the ideal form. Let's go to the scorpion, because I love this example. This is Mani, who is an enormously influential world religious figure who was suppressed, basically. Mani said, hold a scorpion in your hand and tell me there isn't some evil creator. Tell me there isn't somebody who makes evil too. Tell me that evil isn't a principle too. When you look at the scorpion, is it that the scorpion lacks good, or is it that the scorpion possesses something else, something which we might consider evil? I don't know. I mean, there is a good answer to this, which is, how do you know what's good or bad for the scorpion? But Manichaeanism is what follows from Mani. The principle that, or the idea that evil is a principle, that there is such a thing as evil. And in fact, this we've touched on this many times in the course, students, so I'm sorry for boring you. But Manichaeanism, or Manichaeism, is such an important counterweight to the Christian series of ethics that develop. For Manichaeanism, or Manichaeism, and for Mani, evil is a principle indeed, yes, there is an evil. And in fact, it's such a positive force, or a force in itself, rather than an absence, that there is an evil God as well. For Manichaeism, there are two gods. An evil God who perhaps created the scorpion, as well as other things, natural disasters, earthquakes, the human body, for some branches of this thought. And then there is a good Christian God, or other God, who created the soul. So then we get a series of binaries. Body, evil, soul, good, world, evil, heaven, good. A series of binaries which are deeply, deeply, deeply problematic for later Christian thinkers. And in fact, so much so, it is almost disgusting to hold these views. Because it's, for a lot of Christian thinkers, Augustine being the first and most prominent among them, who was a Manichaean, and then rejected it. And so, for Augustine, as the foundation of Christian ethics, whatever the answer to the question of what evil is, it cannot be Manichaean an answer. It cannot be Mani's answer. It must not be that evil is a separate godly force. It must not be this. So in this line of thinking, evil is a principle indeed. So if you sin, as a Manichaean, you are simply being attracted by something, like as if there were an enormous magnet somewhere in the cosmos with evil written on it, which is drawing you in. Which is, of course, the opposite of the Augustinian Orthodox view. The Augustinian Orthodox view is evil an absence, develops out of Plato, develops out of that idea that evil is a privation of good. Evil is the absence of good. I remember Yevgeny Grishin doing this quite well with a piece of paper and punching a hole in it. He didn't punch it, he just, I think it was a delicate pencil stroke, and said this is evil. For Augustine, it's an absence. It's simply a gap where something good could be. Now, as I recall, for Plato, the definition of being is good at some level. Right? So being itself is good. And so to be evil, by definition, is not being, if you like. Well, for Augustine, we go back to Augustine of Hippo. Here he is holding his flaming heart. He lays this out pretty succinctly. This is actually one of his earlier works. His thinking does slightly change on this as he gets a little bit older, as he gets a bit more pessimistic, as he actually it's quite dark. Late Augustine is quite a dark character, but in his earlier work at least, Here we go. It's a long quotation, but it's worth it. And I put it on the slides for the students to copy and paste into their exams. Not in a plagiaristic way, you understand, in a quoting way. For what is that which we call evil but the absence of good? In the bodies of animals, disease and wounds mean nothing but the absence of health. Interesting analogy. So a disease is an absence of health for Augustine. He's not thinking of disease then in a bacterial or viral sense, which is, of course, he's not capable of that. For when a cure is effected, that does not mean that the evils which were present, the diseases and wounds, go away from the body and dwell elsewhere. They altogether cease to exist, for the wound or disease is not a substance but a defect in the fleshly substance. Just in the same way, what are called vices, these are the sins, guys, the sins, the deadly sins in the soul are nothing but privations of natural good. And when they are cured, they are not transferred elsewhere. When they cease to exist in the healthy soul, they cannot exist anywhere else. It's pretty stark, this. So then evil, in this view, it's a nothingness. It's a corruption, but not a thing, not a substance, and not a positive force. It's the absence of a good force. It's the absence of health, which is defining disease for Augustine, and not the presence of some other thing which has taken you over. Now, I try to think of all of our lectures and where we've seen this idea of evil as absence, of sin as an absence of doing something good. I think sloth was one we encountered. Of course, sloth is inactivity, not willing to do anything, being willing to dwell in nothingness, to dwell in no activity at all. There's one place we saw it, but then I thought of envy, invidia, and which was one of the more exciting sins in the sense of there's a very rich medieval philosophy of what it is to envy. And a lot of it has to do with self-destruction. A lot of it has to do with attacking others. But mostly it's a fixation on the eye, envy, on the eye, the organ of the eye. And the idea of not seeing, and if we zoom a little bit closer in, this is Giotto's imagination of invidia or envy. When you're envious of others, and the students will remember this very well, it's not wanting something someone else has, it's wanting someone not to have the thing they have. It's not, as we said, it's not wanting what another rival university, Sotscombe, it's not wanting what Sotscombe have, it's wanting Sotscombe not to exist. That's the envious and frankly evil act. We don't want that, Tomasz. That's the evil act. That's invidia. It's a spiteful thing. It's about depriving others of the thing that they have. Now the definition of this, and this is why you see it's the slander of envy which comes back to bite you. The definition a lot of medieval thinkers and writers and artists and poets come up with for this is that it's something in your eye which blocks you from seeing. That ultimately this affliction of wanting others to fail is not seeing others for what they are, vulnerable human like us, ethical beings. Potentially ethical beings. It's seeing them as rivals, which is not seeing them whole. We don't see Sotscombe whole. Sorry, I shouldn't keep using that example. We see a distorted version of ourselves. We see our own spite comes back to bite us. Instead, the loving thing, the non-sinful thing to do is to take the snake out of your eye and see it for what it really is. So I wonder if this relates to evil as absence. I wonder in the sense that when I follow the evil of invidia or envy, I'm not seeing anymore what I should be seeing. I'm not seeing the world. I'm blocking myself from the world. I'm in a state of absence or blindness. Okay, easy enough so far. Can evil be a choice? I thought this one was so simple. I thought there was no need for this slide because we, the students, we've been discussing every week how, and we started with Rowan Williams, the theologian's definition of what is sin. And his definition was two parts. When you choose something which corrupts you, or is bad for you, your own health. It's quite an interesting definition, quite strange in a way. Sin is not defined by this modern theologian, Rowan Williams, by what it does to others necessarily. It's something which can corrode oneself in the understanding that all things that damage people around you also damage you. But it's the choosing that we've emphasized so often. Choosing to do something makes it sinful. So if I accidentally kill someone, it's not a sin. It's still bad, obviously, but it's not a sin because I didn't choose to do this thing. I'm not in a state of mortal sin. I'm in a state of mortal trouble with the law, but it's not the same thing. But now comes the problem. Can it really be a choice? Can it really be a choice? Can you really choose to do the evil thing? Now, what do I mean by this? What's the problem? The problem is Okay, so let's just put it in strict terms. There was a group of Oxford University first year moral philosophy students, and they were asked this question, and they had a preamble, and then the question was, can you choose evil? And it was exactly 50-50. So one half say, yes, of course, you can, what do I mean by this? You can know what the wrong thing is, but still do it. That was the question they were given. So you know, for example, that gluttony is wrong, and you know it in your heart, and yet you still commit gluttonous acts. Or you know lust is wrong, but you still commit lusty acts or whatever. And of course, half the students say, well, this is ridiculous. Of course you can do this. This is every day of our lives. This is every day of our lives. We have this problem. You know, who here hasn't committed one of the 7 deadly sins this morning or this afternoon? Like at some level, at some small level, right? Despite not knowing it's wrong, you know? Despite knowing that it's wrong. So one half of the students say that, and I think that's pretty common sense. Maybe the even more brilliant half of the Oxford students say no. What on earth could their justification for this be? It's pretty obvious, isn't it, Louis? The microphone is.
Good argument to say that you never have any choice.
Let's give this. It'd be good to hear Louis' argument.
Well, because you can always resort to one of the main theses in philosophy, which says that you can never choose anything really deep down.
Okay, all right. So we have the free will response, which is there's no such thing as choice in a deterministic universe. I think Julie has the. Okay, yes, I accept that, although maybe that was too brilliant even for Oxford. Julie?
I obviously share with his thought, my thought was Louis, because it's pessimistic. This is why we need the afterlife, because this is impossible not to be sinful, and humans are by definition sinful. So all we can do is just to prepare for the other life where it's going to be choice.
Yes.
And there is no such life, just in case.
So, as in... Yes, I agree with you. And of course, in Christian theology, no one makes it to heaven except the saints. We all have to go to purgatory for 5,000 years, 10,000 years. Pretty grim. Dante is still on Terrace 1, according to Italian critics. Yep.
Well, even without relying on the better world, you can still, I think, even if you believe that deep down things are determined, try to realize that, well, if you understand things better, then you can, by learning, avoid doing silly things that hurt you and others. In other words, evil things.
I think we're getting...
Even if you abstain from doing evil, well, in deep down, according to this deterministic view, of course, it's in the end ultimately a matter of luck, right? You are determined to learn something and to improve your behavior.
I think I probably philosophically agree with you, Louis, but I think we're getting closer to the medieval problem here, but I think it's even more simple than anything that anyone said. It's so simple. How can you make evil your choice? If you really knew, the point is, obviously the problem is you think you know that lust is wrong and then you commit it. And so you're in a position of perversity where you know something's wrong but you still do it. But the argument, and it comes through Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and Aquinas, all of them agree that at some level, you must not have really known to really know good. If you really know and absorb the principles of good and reason, then it would be impossible to choose evil. And by definition, if you choose, it means you don't know. So it's one of these tricksy philosophical points where it's a trap. The very act of choosing it shows you don't know. And I just wonder about this. Well, look, there are many different medieval discourses that we've talked about which diminish your level of choice. I mean, on one hand, we talked about the humours, and we talked about this briefly when we talked about anger, but also sloth, melancholia. As you can see, yellow bile, if you have a preponderance of yellow bile in your body, if that's the kind of character that you have, guided by the element of fire, an overproductive gallbladder, you'll have choleric, you'll be bitter and short-tempered and daring, you'll appear greenish and yellow. Anger as a sin, as a mortal sin, as a deadly sin, can be part of this. I didn't choose it, it was in my nature. So that is one way. And of course, as you can see, the melancholic subject who's given to sloth maybe suffers from a spleen problem and so on. That's one way of answering that question. But if we go back to Aquinas and reason, the idea is that once you have aligned yourself to reason, once you've really absorbed the principle of reason, and here actually, Louis, if we go back through philosophy, we can think of someone like Heraclitus and his Logos, which is actually very similar to this, if you follow reason, then you will live a life which is in a golden mean, and this is also Aristotelian, isn't it? So you won't be proud, you won't be pusillanimous, you'll have humility, because you'll follow reason, you'll order yourself to reason. is this choosing? And so then it would, if you lived completely according to reason, it would be impossible for you to be proud or to be pusillanimous, because you would respond to every situation with reason. So maybe it's difficult to think about it as a conscious choice, but if you think about it as a form of behavior which accords to a certain alignment of the individual, if you're fully aligned with reason, then it's impossible to choose sin. At least this is one theory for Aquinas. We also talked about choosing in this context, and the students will remember this well because we read Augustine's letter on anger. And he argued a kind of intoxication model of anger, which is, he said, don't get angry at all, don't let it into your heart or body or whatever, whatsoever, not even one small bit. And it was kind of like an intoxicant. It was kind of like Alcoholics Anonymous. Don't have one drink, because one drink is the gateway to more drinks. And the only way out of alcoholism is to be clean. This is one argument. Augustine had the same argument with anger. If you become angry, there's this danger that you'll be consumed by your anger, that you'll stop being a human at all. You will become homo, ira, or whatever, angry, right? And the point for Augustine was you'll get to a moment where you start to cherish your anger. And it's not clear where on this stepladder, this great descent into hell, you'll do this, but you'll get to a moment where you start to cherish your anger. We saw this with all 7 deadly sins, that often the commentators say the problem is not when you start to sin, it's not the temptation of the sin, it's not the beginning, it's the moment when you start to enjoy the sin. You start to have a surplus relationship with the sin. Gratuitous might be a word. Cherishing, love, enjoyment, those are the words that come up again and again in the literature. But of course, it's impossible to know where you do that. Is that choosing, or is it being hooked like an intoxicant? I don't know. Again, Louis.
I would say that according to the philosophy you've been a little bit promoting, since cherishing means roughly choosing in agreement with your reasonable theories or worldviews, then it is a sin, because you choose in agreement with wrong ideas, wrong worldviews to which you adhere, right? So this, if you believe in choice, if you are not a determinist, then, as you just said, choosing would then be doing things which are in agreement with rational beliefs, right?
Right.
And this cherishing, anger, I think it can be construed as meaning, choosing in accordance with, ideas you love, you begin to like, and therefore it would be an evil choice, right? A choice.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the thing we're dealing with here in this medieval universe of philosophy is moral absolutes and reason as an absolute system. You can't have your reason and my reason, or reason which is reasonable for someone in this situation. There's an absolute reason which Aquinas is dealing with, for example. But I take your point. Yes, Andre.
Can you voluntarily limit the scope of your reason? That is to say, you have a reasonable understanding that something is wrong, but then you decide it's not that you're mistaken about, you temporarily think, well, maybe it's not wrong, maybe it's right. But you just think, well, my reason is not going to determine my life 100%. I will just leave 20% for sinful behavior. I know it's not reasonable, but I just don't want my reason to be.
It's interesting that it'd be great to have the students' answers to that, because I think that they would instinctively think of like 20 examples from the 8 weeks. As far as I'm aware, what this comes down to is an acceptance of how much margin for sin do you allow in your life at some level. I mean, for Evagrius, and I don't know about percentages, so like on Sundays I do sinning. Well, the students will remember well that this actually does happen, this ludicrous situation of which day of the week do we sin, is the truce of God, the peace of God, this 11th century contract, which is there's too much fighting, there's too much murder, no murdering on Wednesdays and on Sabbaths, and let's just limit the murdering. But it's true, it's like no fighting on these days, and we discussed it, the students, we said, well, actually, if a parent had an intervention with a child and said, right, you're going to limit your, for sake of argument, let's just say chocolate intake, but you could substitute drugs, alcohol, cigarettes. Not on Wednesday, you're not going to do it on Wednesday, you're not going to do it on Saturday. Well, it's the beginnings of a certain privation for yourself, which can lead to total abstinence. Cigarette smokers often give up. I no longer smoke on Wednesdays and Fridays, or I no longer smoke in the mornings. So actually, really, Andrei, this is like the thread or the breadcrumb trail that leads to a total purification from sin. So you're already on the trail if you have this 20% rule. Really, it does come down to what margin do you allow for sin in your life. Evagrius Ponticus in the desert in Egypt in the 4th century argues that, all right, these are generic thoughts, they come to us all. You cannot stop the sins. There's no door that you can close that stops the sins coming in.
But you can regret and ask for it.
Oh, precisely. Yes. But you can regret and repent, exactly, or you can fortify yourself to make yourself stronger when the temptation does come. Now, if that involves a percentage increase or decrease or substitution, whatever. For Evagrius, therefore, it's a much more flexible idea of how this moral system works. It allows for some acceptance, whereas there are others for whom there's no margin whatsoever. And Augustine kind of starts that there. Don't even become angry. There's no margin there because it's like stepping onto a slide which is greased with oil or something. You're going to slip. You're going to fall. There's no way of saying, oh, just have a dip your toe. There's no dipping your toe here. And for some of them, and you can imagine monks who want to be chaste. You can imagine those ascetics who fast and don't have any food at all, as we discussed. For some, there's an absolute system. For others, there isn't. All right, let's go to the final of these what is evil sections. You can get back on the bus if you missed the choice part. Is human nature evil? And this is the problem. So let's just reiterate that likely exam question. is to fight the sins, to fight human nature. Is that what we're seeing? And let's go back to Dante then, just because it is wonderful. And you saw with Canto 5 in the Inferno, last seminar the students saw Paolo and Francesca. And it's a wonderful scene because the two lovers, they're blown upon the breezes for all eternity. And she says, look, I loved Paolo, and look, I'm still in love with him, even though we're tossed on these winds. I'm still in love, which is marvellous. It's a romantic scene in the Inferno. It's so beautiful. Dante listens to the speech, the character of Dante in the poem listens to the speech. She says, oh, love overtook us, love did this, love did that. We were victims of love. And Dante at the end faints. He actually faints. It's the only time in the poem he faints. Think of all the things he sees in that poem, but that's the only time he faints. So he's given to, and what am I trying to get at? The idea that at some level God is cruel, shaping human nature beyond what is even imaginable. So Paolo and Francesca, most readers, when they read that, sympathize. They agree with Dante. The students, for the most part, begin by sympathizing with Paolo and Francesca. It's beautiful. Of course, they fell in love. How could they help it? It was beauty. They're still in love in hell. It's a symbol of the triumph of the human spirit, even in prison. And I would think again of Primo Levi in Auschwitz. It's such a beautiful, if you haven't read it, If This Is a Man by Primo Levi, it's beautiful. But most beautiful is that moment he's trying to remember Dante when he's this French guy and the two of them are carrying the soup together. And Levi is trying to remember, on the brink of forgetting all of language, for all Levi knows that all Italian memory might be annihilated by the Nazis, but he, in that moment, wants to remember the lines because it's important as a symbol that humanity can triumph despite the most despicable shackles. And so we discussed this, right? So is God a cruel God trying to limit human nature? But as we read that canto, Paolo and Francesca, we realized what's actually happening is a level of manipulation. Dante faints, but later in the poem regrets having fainted. When he goes into that section of hell, there's a beast called Minos who tells him, beware what you listen to in hell, don't trust everyone who speaks. So that frames that encounter. In actual fact, what we see is that Francesca is blaming everyone but herself for her problems. Like, it's not our fault we fell in love. He was just so beautiful, I couldn't help myself. The timing, my husband was so cruel, I couldn't help but betray him. What happens is the husband kills both lovers, and that's why they're dead and now in hell. It's a sad moment, but for Dante later on, and you get the feeling that he reflects that this is another kind of manipulator. This is not a perfect human nature which is being limited by hell. This is a corrupt human nature which is hypocritical and which lies. It's quite sad, really. All right, so this question. We've encountered this in previous weeks, like the question of anger. We had the debate between Seneca and Lactantius about anger. Is anger natural to the human or not? Should anger be a mortal sin? It's pretty it's pretty harsh to call it a deadly sin, right? Anger, deadly sin. But we all get angry at small things. If you shut my finger in the door, I probably won't get angry with you, Louis. But if you did it 5 times in the same day, I might start to get angry by the end. All right, 6, 7. Anger seems to be something which comes with for a reasonable cause sometimes. These guys, however, had a wonderful debate about this. For Seneca the Younger, and it was interesting because by defining anger as against nature, you have to define human nature as something else, something other than what the passions reveal to us. For Seneca, in his argument, there he is, De Ira, on anger, very early Christian era. Anger is not natural. Humankind is born for mutual assistance, anger for mutual ruin. The former love society, the latter estrangement. So in other words, anger is not natural for the human. This kind of sin is not natural to the human because he is defining human nature as defined by mutuality, kindness, and socially, whatever you call it, supportive. So anger is de facto contra nature. Lactantius, however, the Christian writer had the alternative view. For the Christian writer Lactantius, unlike Seneca, it's the opposite. If you don't get angry, you can't love. God has to be angry because without anger, no love. The emotions are not, you can't exclude one and not the other for Lactantius, and that was quite important. So, therefore, fighting anger, is it perfecting human nature? For Lactantius, anger is part of human nature, but we must fight it. So therefore, to fight the sins, we are at odds with ourselves. We are at odds with human nature. Aquinas, of course, comes up with an answer to this paradox, which is never resolved, but Aquinas' one answer would be that we're meant to be in accord with reason. And so consequently, you can get reasonably angry, but not unreasonably angry. You can get reasonably gluttonous, like, you need to eat a certain amount, but not unreasonably. So that's one fix to this problem, is morality, is fighting the sins, fighting human nature. Well, it's fighting the unreasonable aspects of human nature which need to be tamed for Aquinas. But nevertheless, that's an unresolved problem. You think of someone like Nietzsche, for whom this is exactly the problem with the Christian moral system. It's a system that basically, as he said, it hates human nature. Christianity is in opposition to it. It hates life, as I think Nietzsche said at one point. It's a system determined to hate life and all things that make life what it is. But even there, it's still the paradox. And I don't think Nietzsche quite solves the problem because, but anyway, we haven't time for that. Okay, so everyone with me. Any questions about what is evil or comments, things I missed out? Julie? And also we can ask the students afterwards. Julie, yeah.
Yeah, just to come back a bit about God as absence and, evil as absence or as a presence. What if you think about the apophatic theology here and Meister Eckhart? And, and it starts actually from Plato, for whom it's not only ideas, but first it's chaos, so it's absence of everything. And God is kind of thought later on as the absence. And
yeah, I think that's obviously an impossible question to answer. So apophaticism is so popular, isn't it? And so you have Denis the Areopagite, who's the consummate figure. So negative theology, if you're not aware of it, there is one school of theology which is you must affirm and then reject everything. And in order to discover God, you must affirm all things and then reject them. Is God this chair? No, he's not. We must look elsewhere. And it's this process of realizing the insufficiency of all things and the imperfection of all things. God is at the bottom of all of those absences. Once we've cleared our mind of all things, we can finally encounter God in our own nothingness. Another school of that apophaticism is self-annihilation through loving God, which I'm much more interested in, actually. We talked about Bernard of Clairvaux, you must annihilate yourself, like a drop of water becomes part of the wine. This is like the model of self-annihilation. You are the drop of water, you'll become nothing, but you'll also become part of the wine. That's the paradox which he explains quite well, I think, as well as you possibly can explain that ridiculously difficult idea. That's the kind of way of envisaging annihilation. But But I haven't answered your question because because you're saying that God is absent, but also evil is absent. So how do we square the circle?
No, the evil is going to be presence, but presence of anything, including the image of God. And so it's complicated. And in this way, the rationality would be sought even if we are fighting sins and we are trying to fight our nature, still sin because we kind of trying to overpower God. So reason is evil too.
Yeah, look, this is extremely negative, isn't it? In all senses.
Thank you.
This is the problem. This is what I love so much about Christian theology. You want to become nothing to become part of God, but you have to. How do you become nothing? Through some kind of positive action in the world. And also, so it doesn't work outright, and every move you make in this game of trying to become nothing is a problem. Like St. Francis of Assisi tried to become nothing, you become a cult, and then you become depressed because of this paradoxical status.
That's Augustine path, right?
I think all of them actually.
Yeah.
All of the great medieval thinkers confront this problem at some level. But it's surprising how few people put their money where their mouth is and try and live a life of nothingness. We saw Marie Doignes earlier, or rather Catherine of Siena, eating nothing but Eucharist wafers, drinking nothing but, the pus of people's wounds. This is the extreme. This would be extreme negativity. But in that negativity is a sort of pride. So we come back, which is why Aquinas is like the safe cushion figure in all of these debates. By making reason an absolute, you allow for something which is livable and possible. Possible as a way of getting to God, right? So I'm sort of losing the thread. Guys, are any questions from Zoom? Any questions from this box? Does anyone look like they have a question? You may ask at any time. Okay, guys, let's move on to the very final part of the series, the lecture series, which is how to fight sin. I thought it would be fun at this point to go back through 5 different ways that we've encountered across all 7 deadly sins for actually what do you do with these sins? How do you fight them? Of course, we're talking about the Middle Ages. I'm not going to include here modern ideas of fighting sin and what that looks like. Maybe you can chip in some modern equivalents. That would be fun. If there's anything I failed at in this course, it's being modern enough, I think. One thing I would say at the outset is the sins are deadly. There's no question. Through all medieval debates, they're deadly in a very real sense that they can lead to death directly. Also that they set off other sins. They are the grandparents of all of your sins. So the idea is, like everyone's related to Genghis Khan or something, in this room because statistically he had so many children. Well, you must know this theory, right? Genghis Khan had sort of 250 children, so consequently, statistically, we're all related to him genealogically. Well, anyway, likewise for the sins. The 7 deadly sins are like our super grandparents of all sins. Any sin that you encounter, anything you do, lying, hypocrisy, shutting my finger in the door, they're all part of they all have their grandparents as one of the sins. But the sins are all deadly in this sense as well, that pursued to their logical conclusion, they lead to your death. You can probably match these up with the different sins. Incidentally, gluttony was earlier. I mean, gluttony has an obvious deadly element to it. In medieval writing, we didn't really talk about it, but there's passing out, there's dying from overindulgence and so on, although that's probably the least deadly in them. This is Cleopatra, by the way, and her lust, which is associated with her suicide. And the snakes are quite important in that respect. This is a horrible image, isn't it? It doesn't look like how we imagine Cleopatra. In this, this petrified, deciduous forest. It's so funny. Can you match up the rest of the sins? Probably. Anger, obviously leading to your destruction in many different ways. Usury, this is avarice, greed, over-fixation on material things, meaning that you're not prepared for death or that death bites you unexpectedly. Envy, invidia, Judas's envy and his suicide. Suicide also the problem for Arcadia or sloth. Despair as being the basement of sloth or inactivity. And pride, finally, hubris and hubristic decline, which needs no gloss. What about fighting the sins then? I've got my 5 colour-coded answers to this. I mean, let's go through 5 of them. 5 different ways of fighting the 7 deadly sins, all of them presented by our medieval authors, all of them presented in vivid ways, all of them deeply, deeply flawed as a system for living your life to fight sin. Rejecting the world, number 1. Number 2, following reason. Number 3, redirecting your sin. Number 4, following your sin. And finally, living with it. We'll go through these 5, okay, and this will probably be fairly quick. Rejecting the world. This is the most obvious, and this is where fighting the 7 deadly sins begins. It begins with Evagrius Ponticus in the 4th century. It begins with John Cassian also in the 4th century, the early Christian era. Here's, look, Fra Angelico's portrait of these early desert fathers, flying from the world, going away from Alexandria into the desert of Egypt, what they thought of as the great wilderness, but really it's like 30 miles from Alexandria, but still, you know, it's the desert in their imagination. Living that life which rejects the world. So this is the simple technology, if you like, of fighting sin at the very beginning of the discourse of the 7 deadly sins. Reject the world. Does it work? Well, no, these monks are plagued by these generic thoughts. That's why they write about it. There are certain sins which obviously can be solved this way. Avarice and greed is one of the easiest ones. If you're not involved in any economy, then it's quite easy to fight greed, but not really. The problems with rejecting the world as a system, obviously not everyone can become a monk, and this doesn't solve human sin. It's a kind of an individualistic way of fighting sin. I love Dante's response to this, though, and we go back to the terrace of invidia in the Purgatorio. The students will remember this, but for you guys, how do we solve our envy in purgatory? And this is 1,000 years of our afterlives, so you get prepared for this concept. Is rather ingeniously for Dante, their eyes are sewn together with iron wire. They cannot see. The envious souls, which is all of us. You all have to do all 7 sins, by the way. It's just a question of how long you have to spend doing them. And they're also, so then they depend upon one another. So this is the idea. They're propped up against each other, so they're in a community. This is, in fact, the opposite of rejecting the world. This is Dante's response in many ways. How do you fight sin? How do you fight a sin like envy? Not by rejecting the world, not by running away from other people. It's by embracing other people, recognizing that we depend upon other people. That's Dante's response. So in many ways, the reject the world hypothesis we don't need to spend too much time on. It's the simplest way to fly from sin, but it has a tendency to blame everyone else for the sin and not oneself. Oh, I won't have any sins if I go and live in an apartment in Chumin on my own. But no, you can't really escape sin. Dante's answer then, face the world, face other people, not reject it. This is where I get too much into a preaching mode, isn't it? Following reason. This is obviously Aquinas' a strategy that we associate with Thomas Aquinas, which is to say that the real way, the foolproof way across all 7 deadly sins to fight the sin within your own being, is to follow reason. We've already touched upon this. Accord yourself to reason. Align all of your thinking and all of your action with what is proportionate, what is reasonable. Actually, this is exactly the wrong slide to have up here, but this was just an illustration that there were certain sins which were useful and certain which were not. Lust as something delightful, Aquinas makes less than greed, which is something, at least you desire something which is useful. So this is like how following reason can even allow you to distinguish between different temptations. But yeah, for Aquinas it's quite simple. If you make reason like your spine, the whole center of your being is what is reasonable, what is proportionate, then you will not become proud because you know, no, I don't estimate myself above or below what I should be. Like Aquinas says, for example, if you said, well, the way to fight pride is to think of myself as less than everyone, to be humble, to lie on the floor and wear rags, he says, well, this is not really fighting pride. It's another kind of pride. It's really inverted pride. The answer is to say, well, give yourself a reasonable assessment. Well, how much should I estimate myself? What are my abilities? And that way, if, for example, you are the mayor of a city, you have things to do. People depend upon you. If you're teaching a Problems of Modern Science course, Louis, and people depend upon you to teach them, right? You can't say, oh, I know nothing about science, I'm nothing, I'm humble, you need to read the books, don't ask me, I know nothing. Then you're not doing your duty. You would never, it's a teaching strategy that might work to get people to study for themselves.
That's exactly what I'm saying, be careful.
But you see, the thing is, right, I wouldn't do it either, right? This is why Aquinas' reason principle works much better than other attempts like flee the world, because it respects the fact that some modicum of all of these behaviors are necessary to live in a way and function in a world. Louis?
Yeah, and one could immediately also say that Aquinas himself is trying to teach us lots of things. So you could say, well, this is really not very modest. My favorite answer to why, how to be modest is the following. Well, it comes always down to determinism. Deep down, we are determined to be the way we are. So, this idea of the self-made man, of the genius who finds it all by himself or realizes it all by himself, that's a very shallow idea according to this hypothesis, you see?
Yes, I totally agree. And it's a good demonstration of how the reason argument fits with contemporary ideas. So
True.
Aquinas, as we saw when we read, actually that principle of following reason as fighting sin can be applied to modern discourses in psychology about hubris or narcissism. Like, it argued that it's actually an unreasonable assessment of self rather than some other pathologization. It's about reason. Okay, let's move on to strategy 3, or C. Redirect the sin. And this is an opportunity, just one more time, to quote Hadewig of Brabant, because this is one of the most extraordinary love poems of the Middle Ages. And it's a love poem to Jesus himself, to the physical body of Jesus. And this is Hadewig. I desire to consummate my lover being Jesus, completely, and to confess and to save it in the fullest extent, to fulfill his humanity blissfully with mine and to experience mine therein, and to be strong and perfect so that I in turn would satisfy him perfectly, to be purely and exclusively and completely virtuous in every virtue. And to that end I wished inside me that he would satisfy me with his Godhead in one spirit, and he shall be all he is without restraint. It gets more passionate than that. But that's kind of the extreme, or one of the extremes of Hadewig's passion. There's no question that this is physical in her imagination. There's no question that there is some modicum of lust here. She's not the only one. I mentioned this last week, so sorry, two or three of you who were here, but Angela Foligno famously stripping all her clothes and embracing the crucifix. This is actually quite a popular idea. Bernard of Clairvaux, who we talked about in class, from a male perspective, has the same fantasy, and he feminizes God, if you like. This idea that you redirect your lust. It's okay to be lusty, because that's a divine spark, but the trick is to redirect it to the good. So this is one theory of how you fight the sins. Embrace the sin, but redirect it. Anger, it's a good thing as long as it's against the right person. Sloth, it's a good thing if it leads you in the right direction to something better. Pride is a good thing as long as it allows you to assert yourself to correct other people's evils and so on. Lust, a good thing if you direct it back to God. Maybe slightly more confusing for us to grasp, but it's there. Anger, we saw with Judith and Holofernes this famous moment. It's not really until Lucas Cranach the Elder that we actually get a psychologically sophisticated engagement with this. But she's a woman in the Old Testament who cuts off the head of a tyrant. Right, she commits this angry act, and it's described as a moment of divine anger. What was interesting in a lot of earlier medieval art is it showed a sort of serenity, a stoic serenity about the act. Like, I do it, I don't get angry as I do it, I just do it because it's God's will. Whereas in later images like this one, it's much more, you can see the bubbling anger. You can see the anger which has been redirected towards something just. Maybe you can see it a little bit in this miniature, I don't know. I love that Cranach. I think it's just such a great image of anger. So redirect the sin is one way. Work with it. I suppose connected to that is the slightly more subtle idea of following the sin. We had Oscar Wilde. He's not obviously a medieval thinker, but in some ways, the only way to get rid of temptation is to yield to it. That's quite a common quote, but the last part of the quote is quite important. Resist it and your soul grows sick with longing for the things it has forbidden itself. Actually, there is an ethics to Oscar Wilde there, but I throw it in just for a bit of fun because there's so much condemnation of temptation. But more serious, I suppose, is Dante's idea of what you should do with your sloth. Follow your sloth. I suppose one way of putting it is the only way out is through. The only way out some of the sins, some of the time, is to go through them. and come out the other side. What does this mean? It's maybe not applicable to all of the sins, maybe not, but maybe, I suppose, learning why something is a sin is what I think we're getting at here. The idea that you can't choose something, you wouldn't choose sin if you really knew what was good. I think for someone like Dante, you can't really understand why sin is destructive or corrosive of the individual until you've actually been through it, all the way through it, down to the darkest bottom. Not something you can do with anger necessarily. I don't think you should murder someone and then say, oh God, now I realise it was sinful. I see it now for what it is, although actually that is a serious issue in other forms of thought about redemption and so on. Dante, I'll go over this one more time because I like it so much. The idea of the commedia as a midlife crisis, as actually about depression, suicidal depression, redeemed. For Dante, remember the first line, midway through the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. We learn in Purgatorio 1, the next part of the poem, that Virgil assures the readers, at least, Dante was suicidal in that moment. When Dante finds himself in a forest, it's because he is near suicidal. He's going to kill himself. He's so depressed. He's at the bottom of Arcadia. He finds himself in a rut, in a hole in the ground, where he can't escape because of his own depression, his own inertia. And at precisely that moment, he came to himself. He'd lost the straight way. He comes to himself. The idea is that the whole commedia, in fact, is a drama of one person's descent into what their suicide would entail, what the destruction of the human really looks like, and then redeems themselves on the other side, like go to hell and purgatory and paradise and discover why you should live an active life rather than a passive one or rather than a depressed one. It's going quite far, possibly, but it is this idea that follow the sin. It's like something which has a golden thread which will lead you out the other side to some other kind of reasoned virtue. A rare idea. It would be great to follow in more detail in an essay, but it's too late for that because the deadline's tomorrow. Finally, live with it. Just live with the sin. We only touched on this very, very briefly. I'm very sad that we didn't talk about this more. But actually, beneath all of this moralizing, there was also a triumphant, heroic almost discourse of, but that's human existence, that's living. To live with sin is just as much a part of fighting the sins, if you like, as like defeating them, learning to live with the sins and not be taken in by them. To the full consumption of your being. Obviously we have Hamlet's depression here, but accepting, but this image I wanted to spend more time on. This is, I suppose not, a few of you were here for this, but most of you weren't. This is a pilgrimage badge. This is a badge. You go on pilgrimage. These were discovered in Bruges, actually, Louis, in a riverbed, but they were common around Europe. And then people would come all the way, a long way on pilgrimage, and then they would receive one of these. It's obvious what it is, isn't it? I don't need to say. It's simply three penises carrying a vulva in a parody of an Easter procession. That the vulva obviously has a crown, obviously. Why? This is a pilgrimage badge. You go on a pilgrimage and you get this. You buy it as a souvenir, and then you wear it, and it's what? There are all kinds of moralizations about this, or like explanations. Oh well, it's actually just saying that it's a grand metaphor. Like the quest for salvation is like the sexual quest. It does kind of work. Just maybe, I don't know, you're skeptical? Is that what that's saying? You'd be amazed what particularly Victorian critics have to say about this sort of thing. And in fact, they often understandably left them out of catalogues, didn't exhibit them, pretend that that's not what that represents at all, it's something else. It's obviously three tree nymphs holding and so on. I suppose it's an enigmatic image which I thought was a fitting place to end, that often we exaggerate the discourse about sin as one of fighting sin. A lot of the time it's playing with the idea of sin, living with it, flirting with the temptation, which is not the same as giving into it or fighting it. It's somewhere in the middle, the sin here being lust. So that is the end. We can end with, this is Inferno, by the way. This is the great horrifying cone left by Satan as he was thrown to earth, which has now left to us all the different circles. We have reached the bottom of hell, if you like, or the top of purgatory, whichever way you want to see it. So that is the end. Are there any questions? I thought I'd have like a good final line, but I haven't got one at all. Tomasz.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about medieval views on children and whether children are moral creatures or not. In particular, I'm intrigued by this view of evil as absence. Let's say Socrates, evil is absence of knowledge, or, bad deeds come out of ignorance only, right? So if you look at kids, right, obviously they have very little knowledge about the world. And on the other hand, we have this myth emerging, I think it's a Christian myth, of, baby angel, so like innocence related to childhood, right? That kids are the only innocent, really innocent, only pure creatures, they go straight to heaven, right? So how do we go from the Greek view with, kids just being, ignorant and they, so how do we reconcile this, or are these views at conflict, or how you move from one to another?
The cliche about medieval views of children is that they see them as imperfect adults. This is like the most heartless view. As I think I said last week, the sad and difficult thing about medieval writing generally is that children are never there. They're never there. They're not featured. They never appear. There are some appearances, but so rare. I mean, in the Inferno, where are the children? They are mentioned, the unbaptized infants, one line. You think, Dante doesn't dwell on what it might be like to be surrounded by babies in hell. I mean, this is an image that I think is so shocking that we would have it as, at least 3 lines. For Dante, it's half a line, I think, even. They just don't feature. Does that mean that there's a sense that they're irrational or that they're incapable of moral action? I don't know, to be honest with you, Tomasz. There's not much discussion of that. I think Julie is going to pitch in something.
Well, there's the theorists of childhood that claim, it's not rarely, that in medieval ages there were no concept of a child as we know them today. Yeah. So it wasn't something pure as it started to be in Victorian times. And it was just small adults.
Imperfect adults.
We know that still we have this association with children and Bible, and Jesus said that be like children, something.
Yeah, it's Philip Arias, isn't it? Centuries of Childhood. It's a great book. It's the saints. Whenever you come across, when we see childhood is in saints' lives, but whenever a saint is a child, they were already wise. This is the idea. They'll just be like small adults. If they're a particularly good child, will just be already fully grown adult. Like Jesus in early depictions just looks like a little man when he's. So they're not like lovely children, like, a perfect child. A perfect child should be like an adult, in other words.
Yeah, how about Augustine and these 2 babies who hate each other, right? I think it's very important for the Confessions, for the whole logic that there is this, and I actually don't know how it coincides with the idea of the absence. Maybe they lack good because they don't know, right? But remember, he describes two babies who are kind of deprived of milk, kind of compete for milk, and they would kill each other, and they cannot kill each other because they are weak, not because they're good. If they had strength, they would kill your brother and sister, and he actually goes on about that.
Yeah, so you mean that's in a sense a very pessimistic view of human nature coming out, right? For Augustine.
Requires,
something constitutive of, so human divinity is not present in those babies already. Yes, this is true. Although it's also, look how harsh Augustine is on his own childhood, like his own mistakes, like he picks over, or in fact he talks about himself, like, how I hungered for things, how I cried and was hungry, at the breast. Already, like, he's blaming himself, moralizing that moment. So, he's not absolving. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to, Julie, were you going to add something? No.
Yeah, well, I think this is the great end of this class, because of the course as such, because it's still, if you don't have answers, because, well, actually, maybe because it's my midlife crisis, and this is exactly the same, not because of the age, not because. And I think it's the way the despair and the whole of depression, this is where you rationally end up. And after that, you are just, to find a way out of it, just start hallucinating that there are other ways, or that we know now that in psychology we have this positive illusion that keep us going. And depressive realism might claim that, the rational thinking and actually comes to it can't find any way out. So and children in this way is a good image that just purity of thinking, just live with it, just, I don't know, embrace life, something like that, or hallucination that there is afterlife or something. So, but it's not that the answer is at the end. It might be, that was the answer, the absence of the answer, and just later you. To keep living, you just look for illusions.
It's interesting that at the end of Dante's great poem is not some place of rest for the pilgrim. The process of trying to escape the hole of depression. The only stasis in the poem is at the bottom of hell, where there's no movement. Or Dante himself, stuck in his kind of sloth. At the top of paradise, it's constant motion. Nothing ever finishes moving, which is just an interesting way of imagining the relationship between movement and the universe and so on, and morality. That stasis itself, or feeling like you've hit some sort of point of final, is in itself not a sign that you've hit a block in the wrong way. Interesting, but yeah, that doesn't really answer your question. That's because it wasn't a question. That's right. Other comments or questions, Louis?
Yeah. So I can relate to what Julie said, that there is, according to, for instance, philosophical ideas I like, there is a form of illusionism in our behavior. For instance, if you are a determinist, you still believe in the illusion that you can choose, and that that you can be at least a little bit proud of something, or that there are some things which are good and others bad, okay? Mm-hmm. A full determinist could immediately reply, well, you cannot even make a distinction between good and bad because you had to do what you did. I think, by the way, that these concepts of evil, good are ultimately societal concepts, so proposed and maintained by society to keep it away from chaos, to keep it structured. But so this idea of illusion, yeah, that rings a bell to me. I kind of like it. Where I disagree with Julie, I think, is that, if I understand you correctly, you think that one of the messages here of these theological thinkers of the medieval period is that in the end it's you end up with no answers at all, and you end up more with despair than with optimism. Is that correct?
Well, they start with despair, but this is why they have to find a way.
Okay.
And then they end up in despair again as they proceed in their thinking, and then again. But those who don't find any answer, they don't write, they don't preach, right? So we don't know.
Okay, yeah, but there are many philosophical systems which are less pessimistic, and which do claim that insight and understanding and reason can help. And at least if you're excluding very severe psychological conditions, but even in that case, I mean, there are very strong arguments to say, well, no, understanding how the world works deeply will help you to rather be on the right side. Even, yes, it's unavoidable to sometimes do wrong, bad things, and so on. But I mean, personally, I'm a fan of these more optimistic theories, and which link, these optimistic ideas to understanding. We cannot make a whole course on that. That would.
Yeah, it sounds like the Greek optimism. The idea that.
Well, it's not only Greek. There are now modern neuropsychologists and so on who have rather convincing evidence that you can become happier, for instance, under certain conditions of insight and reasonableness. I mean, it's not that frequently studied, but it has been done and it can be done.
I think that actually one of the interesting insights from the Christian theology of morality is the realization that to naturalize good is to create a form of depression which is unbelievably stark, which is if the good is natural, then to not be good is to be unnatural, which is to create this horrible dichotomy where you find yourself, when sinning, feeling like you're against nature and you're less human for it. And it actually is an engine for producing dehumanization. Like, well, sinners are not human anymore. They're turned away from existence.
Many thinkers will say that it will lead to unhappiness. And if you want to be unhappy, okay, that's your problem. But most people won't.
But what I find comforting about, if we go back to the very first thinker, Evagrius Ponticus, is just the basic acceptance that sin is natural and it's going to come like a breeze coming through a window.
Right.
Why is that comforting? Because it doesn't lead to a level of where you start to imagine yourself as outside the order of nature through things that...
It's true, and I can totally relate to that. And a determinist would say, well, obviously, you know, we all necessarily will do some things, but this resonates well with this idea that, you know, well, that's in accordance, in agreement with modern theories of, for instance, neurobiology or biology, which clearly show that, you know, the embryonic versions of all these sins are present in animals, right? You can see animals who are very angry, envious. Maybe the only one which is not present is pride, and who knows? So, I mean, there is a very natural biological tendency in all these creatures who we would certainly not accuse of being immoral. We are not accusing a dog, even if it kills its little brother, of being immoral. It's natural. But, you know, we still, I mean, neurobiologists and philosophers and so on are beginning to make conceptual frameworks to understand why it is still better to be a good and a reasonable person than, and they link this to happiness, you know, common happiness, your own happiness, and so on. And I think that's quite convincing.
Yeah, I know. It's interesting. Is the Mount of Purgatory a system for producing common happiness? I think that Joan Ferrante is a great writer who's written political analysis of Dante, will say, yes, it's ultimately a political system of ethics, how to create a society that functions rather than how to create an individual.
Yeah, I want to ask Peter a question which maybe will help him to somehow, you know, summarize his course.
Okay.
And move towards closure. Do you think the whole, I mean, system of thinking about sins in medieval times, is it become less and less relevant as history goes by, or do you think there is a certain return of certain aspects like New Middle Ages or whatever? So what do you think is the role of all this plays today? In general, and in your life in particular, do you think you are more medieval because you study these things for many years? So, I mean, how it affects you?
I think it's obviously a good question. I think the students would be the good judges for this because, I mean, I think that all of these concepts of sin are intelligible to us. I don't think there have been many of them that were not intelligible. I don't think there were many concepts and models of sin and transgression and moral boundaries that to us were alien. I think that actually what could have been a terrifying dive into an alien thought system was actually a refreshing plunge into a series of ways of thinking about moral problems that we face that actually make sense to us. In my own life, well, look, you know, it's difficult to read all this stuff and not be affected by it. The point, I suppose, is that I'm struck by how, to confront the medieval moral universe, you think that there's going to be a simple and impenetrable answer to all questions, which will be God doesn't want it, or this is the way the world should be, a series of prescriptions which are arbitrary or seem arbitrary to us outside of Christian orthodoxy. But that's not at all what it is. I think that what's been curious for us is that we can substitute, as I've said many times to the students, you can substitute the word God for reason, or God for a political system of ethics, or God for justice, or something like that, or truth. A lot of the times you can substitute that and then make it into a 21st century value system that works exactly identically, in fact, to many of them. What's been striking throughout all the weeks is how A discourse on lust, for example, can connect Thomas Aquinas with Lacan or someone like that. A discourse on pride can connect Aquinas with modern psychologists. Discourses on most of the sins, invidia, too, I think, in psychoanalysis, can be connected. So I don't see anything alien about this system. I just see, in fact, I see a group of thinkers who thought more deeply than most of us do about morality. Why? Because they were professional moral thinkers. They were immersed in a system which took fighting morality and fighting the sins to be a professional vocation. Monasteries were extremely popular places to go. Someone like Aquinas can sit at a desk for 40 years and do nothing but think about the nature of evil, nothing but thinking about the nature of evil. So it makes sense to me that they were more sophisticated and had more developed thought. I think that it seems less developed when we put God at the center and we imagine it to be this alienating system. But when we start to dig into it and understand the vast diversity of what God means to someone like Aquinas versus someone like Augustine, versus someone like Hadric of Brabant, for whom God is a lover, Bernard of Clairvaux, for whom God is like an annihilative bottle of wine that he wants to become part of. I think once we understand the diversity of what they mean by this process, we understand that they're all just different ways of making meaning of that battle that we all share, whether we acknowledge it as a battle that we're going through or not, with the deadly sins. And that's a perfect place to finish, isn't it? That's a perfect place to finish. So thank you so much for attending. Thank you. And thanks, guys.